Well, Gavin, thank you very much for having me. Well, until last year, I was a technical producer over at Photon Engine. And over the last year, I've gone into consulting, mostly for AA and AAA, on the side of course, tech production for multiplayer games. And more recently, I've been focusing on launching the How to Multiplayer project, which aims to capture best practices and patterns on game development in the multiplayer context.
Yeah, that's something that we've talked about a lot, and it's a
Yeah.
exciting thing that we're having these wonderful conversations. And it's kind of like developers that you've either previously known from your other stuff or people you're meeting now. What kind of advice are they coming to you for, and what's the main thing you guys are talking about?
Well, so there's usually a couple questions. Like the first one I get often is, oh, so my publisher told me to add multiplayer. They have the budget for multiplayer. Should I do that? And the answer is usually, I mean, unless it's your idea and it's necessary for the game, no. And then, of course, it comes more down to usually discussions I have with senior leadership and the C-level on a, say, requirements engineering perspective and operational perspective is, okay, we want to have this game, this concept, this GDD. What do we need? Do we have the right resources already? Where do we need to look? What are the things we have to consider? And what are the traps we might encounter? And especially that last one is unfortunately often omitted, and that's when problems tend to arise down the road.
Yeah, I think that's kind of like those problems arise. Like I'm constantly talking to people and then talking and helping them with their like biggest challenges. What's that part of the gaming industry is when they've had that, they say they need multiplayer or they believe they want to go ahead and do it. Like what's that challenge? How do you help them get over it, and how do they get over it?
Right. So I think the main challenge with multiplayer, as far as game development is concerned, not the actual tech development, which is a whole different story, is that it's not difficult, it's complex. Which means any given discipline tends to dive in and see, oh, I can do a bit of that. And then because they have gained that confidence, tends to, well, overlook all the hidden dependencies. And so what I primarily help them to do is unearth these things that tend to snowball left and right if they're not careful, because in multiplayer everything is built on each other and with a connection to each other, meaning you cannot move forward without knowing that everybody on the team is on the same page. And that goes from infrastructure to art to design, and of course then operation and monetization, because at the end of the game, we have something that costs something continuously if you want to run it, right?
Yeah, it is. And you kind of touched on infrastructure then. So like, I know you've got a big understanding of that with multiplayer games, and like, what's your thoughts when you've got like bare metal versus cloud when it comes to the infrastructure for multiplayer games?
Well, I mean, we have seen the whole cloud craze. Well, I mean, not only in games, but across the IT industry.
Everywhere.
These last 2 decades. And it's undeniable that managed services and clouds are incredibly convenient, but that comes at a price, quite literally. And that's where really you need to consider what are you using what for. And bare metal is just literally what clouds run on to begin with.
Yes.
So it is cheaper, yes, it requires a bit more expertise, but it's where you get the most out of it. So the question then becomes one of scale, and which one do you go for which reason?
And I think that's something that I talk about daily. You mentioned the cloud costs, right? Like, and I get it from the developer's point of side. You don't know how many people are going to turn up on that day. I often tell everyone if I had a magic ball that said like, I can tell you how many people are going to turn up to play your game, I'd never need to work a day again.
Yeah.
But like, moving forwards, I think it's something that more and more studios are looking at, is a hybrid approach to their games.
Yeah, and I think that's definitely a way to go. Like, if you want to have a multiplayer game and you go with a state transfer type architecture and have a dedicated server, you need at least one instance running somewhere.
Yeah.
Assuming you're just dealing with one region, I think, you probably want to go with one bare metal server because you'll just be fine. If you have several regions and you're a very small indie, then a cloud might make more sense just because you want the instances closer to the people. But once you hit AA, AAA, scale, then the question is not either or, but it's really both, because you'll want your capacity that you have throughout in bare metal. That's going to save you a lot of cost. But again, because those are actual hardware machines that you need to set up and configure, you also need a buffer when some random event happens that you can't foresee.
Yeah.
But you want to keep the players there, not kick them out. And I think that's where the flexibility of the cloud can be used to basically add a buffer on top of your regular capacity in bare metal.
Yeah, because we've all experienced that situation in a game where you can't get on, something's gone on, and
Yes.
It's the worst thing. It's almost heartbreaking to see it when that happens. And I think that buffer is really important that you're talking about.
Yeah, I mean, we've seen that. Yeah, there are different techniques, right, that developers have used over the years. The most common one we see is either like waiting lists to get into the lobbies, or throttle connections, and that's just, it degrades the user experience, right? Which means from a purely business standpoint, for both user acquisition, user retention, and just user experience overall, it's kind of terrible. And you want to avoid that if you can.
It's not what anyone wants either side of it. No one wants to see that. But so kind of like also for yourself, like for the rest of this year and moving forwards, like you've recently changed across, like what you're doing, like what's big on your agenda?
Well, I mean, the conversation that we have in the space, especially people that dedicate themselves to multiplayer, is we keep seeing the same things being done wrong despite proven patterns having been established pretty much already in the late 90s as far as game development is concerned. And so my big goal for the rest of the year, as well as the next couple of quarters, is really getting a proper peer review group together from the industry, made of both service providers, co-development studios, and studios focusing on multiplayer, to create these patterns that we know exist, that are properly reviewed through the industry, and then so that we can make them available publicly and freely for developers everywhere to be more successful, know what they can do instead of doing what they think should be right and potentially run into a wall down the road, which is always a bit sad. So, basically make sure we capture the knowledge and people get it.
Yeah, that's key for new people starting in, and even studios that have maybe been around a while but only ever focused on single player.
Yeah, definitely.
Moving onwards, I think it's a really cool thing.
Thank you.
So kind of like what I'd also like to know is, so if you could just give a bit of advice to a studio is in that situation, right? They made single player games and now they're moving on to a multiplayer game. What would that advice be?
Forget what you know as what works well from a practices perspective, because multiplayer and single player are built differently, and the technologies have different sets of requirements, both that can be leveraged and that constrain you. So come in really thinking, I don't know how to build this. And if you come with that and you keep your experience from single player, then you will be successful. But don't rely on the single player experience to make a multiplayer game.
It's cool. Well, thank you, Tim.
Thank you for having me.
Cheers.